We've got some really awesome content lined up. As Svan said we are going to be recording today's session, so you can guarantee that from here on out we'll be recording. And these types of events are going to be shared on our YouTube channel down the road as well. So you'll see more and more great content hitting the Amii YouTube. Right now, if you're interested, you can find all kinds of great previous talks from some of our tea time talks at the U of A, from our deep learning and reinforcement learning summer school. So if you're looking to get a quick fix of some technical content on AI, there's some really good resources out there on our YouTube channel right now. And stay tuned for more. Welcome back. So we're really excited to have another virtual AI meetup. These have been going for a couple of years now, every month. We try to host this as a really great way to connect with the broader AI community. And Amii is the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. There's a history, including decades of world-class research that's been happening here at the U of A. That's really put us in a position to be world leaders in AI and machine learning. Whether you're a business, a student, or just looking to get more involved in the community, we have a whole host of great programs and resources at Amii, and would love to connect. You can reach out to amii.ca or chat with us after today's presentations to learn more. Before we get started with today's content, a few housekeeping notes. We're going to try to keep this brief. So the event today is sold out, and so it is oversubscribed, which is great. So we're excited to see so many people interested in tuning in. This is our second virtual meetup, so bear with us if things don't go perfectly. We want to continue to improve each time, so we need to leave some room for improvement for the next one. The session is, again, being recorded. We'll have some time at the end of each talk. We have two awesome talks today. So we'll have some time for a Q&A. And if you feel so inclined during the talk, you're very much welcome to add a question through the chat function. And we'll leave it to the discretion of the presenter on whether they want to address that right away or hold it till the Q&A session. You'll be receiving a quick prompt tomorrow to provide some thoughts and feedback for us. So you don't have to send things via carrier pigeon. We will follow up with you to get some info on how you thought today's session was and some things we can consider moving forward. In lieu of the usual post-meetup hangout schmoozing carrying on that tends to happen after these types of things, we're encouraging everyone to jump onto another virtual event if they're so inclined with Startup TNT. So that's a group that TNT stands for Thursday Night Traditions, and so they host a happy hour, in Discord actually, and we'll share that link out via chat as well. I'll be there, so you're welcome to come and chat with me. They run that every Thursday as well, so please feel free to participate. Otherwise, they will even send you some free kombucha or craft beer if you're participating. And without further ado, we are going to jump in to our first presentation, which tonight is coming from Abhishek, who's part of the RLAI Lab. So please, with a silent nod of acknowledgement and maybe a clap at home, please welcome Abhishek to join us for his presentation. And thank you.
Hey. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking out the time to come out here. I'm going to share my screen now. Warren, I think you have to unshare before I share. Okay, thank you. And yeah, do you guys see my screen? All right, so it's full screen now, right?
Oh yeah, you're good to go. It looks great.
All right. Okay, so let's get started. Hello everyone, I'm Abhishek Naik. I'm a PhD student at the University of Alberta, I'm working with Professor Sutton on reinforcement learning and artificial intelligence. And today this is going to be a very high level and general talk about intelligence. So I'm going to show you various forms of intelligent behavior demonstrated by all the organisms living on Earth, which will hopefully make you see these creatures in a new light. All right, so let's get started. All right, so what you see here is the evolutionary tree, which means that life started here somewhere at the bottom about 4 billion years ago, and then it from single-celled organisms it branched out into all these different species, some of which died out and some of which lived on in different mutations and forms in the forms that we see today. So different mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, so on and so forth. Do you guys also see my mouse pointer?
Yep.
Yes, you do. Okay, good. So I can rely on that. Okay, so on the top here, you see the white lines that end here all represent a species that are present today. And the ones that end, somewhere here, which means that they died off, let's say 400 million years ago or something, right? So all the ones here at the top are things we have today. Now let's zoom into this particular part, so which is this. So we are about 600 million years ago. We all had this common ancestor, which was this small worm-like thing. And from that, over millions of years, we branched out into all these different species, from snails, octopuses to the left, to fishes, frogs, birds, mammals that we know of. So all of this is in the present, right? Now let's look at the first of these, the ones which we are most familiar with, primates. So primates are very similar to humans, right? So like chimps, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans, all of those, right? So this first picture you see that here this monkey has placed this is a cashew nut. He has placed this on a granite slab and he has a stone in his hand. And now he uses that to break the shell open to eat the cashew nut inside, right? So if you're not familiar, cashew nuts don't come in the pristine white form that you see, but they are enclosed in this hard shell, which you have to break by, like at least we do it by roasting and then opening it with a hammer or something. And you see in the wild, this monkey is doing it with a big stone and a slab. So that is some cool use of tools. And on the right, you see this orangutan is very deliberately using a sphere-like thing to catch some fish to eat, right? And so these are some examples of tool use that we see in primates, which they use for different kinds of problem solving, right? But they do a lot more than this as well. So for example, this is something that many people might be familiar with, like Jane Goodall and her James, that since then people have trained many of these animals to learn sign language, and they can learn up to, let's say, 250 sign language words, if that's what they call them, and communicate with the humans who are training them, right? Which is pretty remarkable. But if you go out in the wild, so this is like a bunch of gorillas, silverback gorillas. And so the guy in the middle, this is the alpha. And these are all the people in his tribe. And so they have a lot of complex social dynamics in the sense that, okay, so here's the alpha. And now there might be some other strong male candidates who might be thinking, hey, should I fight this alpha to take over as the leader of the tribe? And if I should do that, when should I do that? And if I do that, will there be any supporters for me, to help me with that? So they have all these complex social situations in which they are doing this decision making. But more than that, they also have these rudimentary calls. For example, they'll make some sort of call when they see, let's say, some predator, let's say a snake, but they'll make a different call when they see, birds of prey like hawks or something. And so they use such calls for communicating among themselves. And it has also been observed that uh, the mothers can recognize their offspring's voice. So let's say a particular offspring makes the sound. So that mother will instantly turn and look at the baby, and all the other members of the tribe turn and look at the mom. So they all kind of uniquely recognize the voice of their kind, which is also pretty cool. And another interesting thing that has been observed in these primates is that when they assemble in such groups, uh, they take turns to talk. So which means like somebody will say something and then somebody else will say something. It's like it's a very polite kind of a conversation that goes on, which is also pretty cool. So all of this demonstrates that, you know, they can use language to some extent and have this kind of social intelligence for communicating with each other and having this kind of hierarchies with which they go about living their lives. And while this is a very limited vocabulary and variety of sounds with like no grammar, it results in effective communication nonetheless, right? And I guess we might expect that of primates because these are, you know, our nearest genetic siblings. We share like 98% of our DNA with them or something. And yeah, so the common ancestor that we had was around 5 to 10 million years ago. But now let's go a step further. Let's go back to birds. So now the most recent common ancestor for us was somewhere here, which is around 300 million years ago, right? And then it branched into birds and primates separately. So what can birds do? How smart do you think birds are, right? So now look at this crow. Is using a stick to reach, you know, some food which is out of reach from its beak, and it uses it very effectively to gather the food. And you might have seen a lot of videos online about crows and other birds which are using all these kinds of, you know, tools like stones and sticks to get the things that they want, which is pretty cool. Now, so that's tool use. And now, of course, everybody knows about birds that migrate. So some birds travel up to like 14,000 kilometers to get away from harsh winter conditions. So to, to put that in context, 14,000 kilometers is like from Canada to India, like halfway across the globe, right? And they do it remarkably efficiently without fail, like without, you know, getting lost and things like that. And that is like, yeah, it amazes me to think how they do it. Um, and so it turns out that they rely on some kind of a combination of, you know, the sun's position, the position of different stars, then Earth's magnetic field, and, you know, certain smells to achieve all of that. And yeah, that's pretty remarkable. And I also want to talk about this bird. So this is a species called Clark's nutcracker. So what it does is when winter is coming in, it hides its favorite seeds, like 3 to 5 in a group, in about 20,000 different locations spread across some big geographical location. And it remembers all these locations for up to 9 months, right? And so it will come back uh, after winter or during those harsh conditions, let's say when everything is covered by 3 feet of snow, and it can still identify all those places where it hid those seeds, up to 20,000 of them, right? And again, that is amazing. Like, how do they do this? Apparently, they, at every particular site where they land, they will look at some markers like, you know, there's a rock there, and then there's the weird looking branch there. And so I'm hiding it here. And so like 6 months later, when it comes back, it will again identify, okay, the angle of that thing is there and here. So now this is where I must have it in it. And they do so for 20,000 locations, which is amazing. I mean, wish we had such abilities, right? We are bad at remembering important events, like 2, 3 of them, despite having technology to assist us. Anyway, yeah, so let's move on to another bird in particular that I want to tell you about. So this was Alex. Uh, Alex was an African gray parrot, and yeah, it was trained to do some of these remarkable things that I'll tell you about, right? So if you look at this tray here, it has some green objects, blue objects. Some of those are cubes. Some of those are, flat cars or key-like structures. Anyway, so what Alex could do is, it could answer questions like, how many green squares are there, or how many cubes are there, up to, so it could count up to 6 and it could tell you all these answers, right? And so it could, uniquely, it could differentiate between concepts like color and an object. So for example, you could say green square or just green things or just, circles, and it could tell you exactly that, right? Which is, uh, yeah, I mean, that needs quite some cognition to be able to do that. And it also seems that he could understand what he was saying, because, let's say he said want grape. So he had, rudimentary vocabulary like this, that, wanna go back, or wanna want banana or something like that, right? And so when he said want grape and you gave him, let's say, a banana, for instance, and he would spit it out and then repeat the request, want grape, right? And so if a child did this, you would readily agree that they really wanted a grape and not a banana, right? Uh, yeah, so yeah, that's seemed to have a decent understanding of words. And then some other cool things that it did was, let's say the first time Alex was offered an apple to eat, so he didn't know it was called an apple, right? So he called it a baneri. And so what's a baneri, right? So Alex had eaten bananas and he had eaten cherries. So maybe the apple tasted somewhat like a banana to Alex, and it looks like a big cherry, right? So that's why he called it banana cherry baneri, which is pretty cool. I mean, uh, yeah, I think a lot of kids would do something like that. And yeah, another thing was that when he was offered cake for the first time, he called it yummy bread, which is what it is, right? Uh, but anyway, so yeah, so he played around with words as well. And so yeah, and then he would do things like, he would get bored when doing all these tests and training. And so sometimes when you would ask him how many objects are there of a certain kind, and there were, let's say, two of them, he would say, one or four, one, four, like just jump around between those two. And then the trainer would get bored and just put this guy back in the cage as a punishment. And then he would scream for them, two, two, I'm sorry, come here, right? Which is, so you're just messing around with the trainer because it got bored. So that's suggestive of uh, sophisticated cognitive processes, because like getting bored and fooling around, right? That's pretty cool. And so yeah, I just want you to remember that this birds are not primates and they are non-mammalian as well, right? So which is, so we have gone quite a lot away from human-like species. So yeah, so how about we now go all the way to octopuses. So they are with whom the nearest common ancestor was present about 600 million years ago, that particular worm that I was telling you about, right? So we started from primates, we looked at birds, and now we are jumping all the way to octopuses. Now, yeah, another important distinction here is that all of these species on the right are vertebrates, which means you have a proper spinal cord and a nervous system that goes through that. And invertebrates don't have a spinal cord. So they have a nervous system, but yeah, it doesn't have any structure. And typically invertebrates are like relatively small compared to vertebrates because of this reason. Right. So let's look at cephalopods, which is a family consisting of, octopuses, cuttlefish, squids. And so yeah, the distinct some of the things that are distinct about these species is that they have these large squishy bodies, like they don't have any bones or any skeleton of that kind. So they have like this head-like thing and some tentacles at the end, maybe 8 or 10 of them. But what makes these guys stand apart is that they have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system which has more neurons than the central nervous system, almost like 3 or 4 times, right? So this is where the distinction between the brain and the body starts getting a little blurry, because like all the animals that we looked at till now have like brains, which have like most of the neurons are concentrated there. Maybe there are some neurons in your spinal cord as well, but yeah, then you have all these metrics like, brain to body ratios that you might have heard about, which people used to use as a measure of intelligence. But yeah, those definitions get very blurry here, because yeah, most of the neurons are in the body, not in the brain. So is this some kind of distributed brain? Seems like that. Anyway, so what can cephalopods do, right? So one of the first things that people have seen is that they can learn from observation. So there was a school experiment in which, you see this box-like structure. So it's like a transparent box, and it has 3 different ways to open it. These are different ways, right? So one is like unscrew and the whole thing will come off. The other is you have to twist it a bit, and this guy, it won't come off, but like you just have to pull and it will hang from the side. So basically 3 different ways. And then there's a crab inside, right, which is food for the octopus. So when you place this here, the octopus tries to figure out ways to get to the crab, and eventually it learns how to open these things, right? So what the experiment was that they trained one of the octopuses to do this. And now when they got a new octopus and placed it in a aquarium just beside this one, so you put a box of crab inside the first octopus's aquarium, and so this guy will go on and open it. And this other octopus is very observant, so it will come and stick to this wall trying to see what this octopus is doing. And then it went back and did the exact same thing, which is use the exact same opening that the first octopus used to get to the crab, and just did that. It didn't have to, try around different things before trying to open it. It knew exactly what to do because it had observed this octopus to do it. So this is something that this is something we refer to as imitation learning in the artificial intelligence community, and that also reflects quite a bit of sophisticated cognition. And yeah, so they also seem to have good memory. So people have conducted experiments in which, there would be like 4 different tubes. They all looked similar from outside, and they would keep food in just one of them. And the octopus would go at first and try out all the different tubes, and it would find the food in one of them. And then they would repeat this experiment in which they would always keep the food in the same tube. And yeah, so over time, the octopus learns that, okay, the food will be in this particular tube and goes directly through that. It does not explore the other tubes at all, right? So yeah, so experiments like these kind of tell you that these folks have good memory as well. And yeah, then they do all these kinds of interesting things so there was this zoo in which there was an octopus in one big aquarium, and then there was another big aquarium with a lot of fishes, right? And so every other day, the zoo officials would come in and see that there were some more fish missing every day. And so they started wondering what was going on, and then they thought that, okay, maybe somebody was coming in at night to steal them or something. So they put like security cameras, and what they saw was that one of the octopuses in the octopus container would, when everything was closed and the lights were off, it would climb up the water tank, go up the tubes which brought in the water to the different aquariums, walk across all the way 30 feet away to this fish aquarium, go inside, eat a couple of fish, and then walk all the way back to its own aquarium, and then be there when the zoo officials came in the morning, right? So like, that's pretty neat. And in some of the lab experiments, some scientists have found that, when they bring in visitors to show them these animals, these octopus, they would take their tentacles out and like squirt water on these strangers because I don't know, they're new faces, not familiar. So yeah, anyway, so that all of these kind of indicates that these have sophisticated cognitive processes going on in their distributed nervous systems. But okay, now let's come to, again, I want to remind you that these are not only non-primate and non-mammalian, they are invertebrate as well. So they don't have a proper spinal cord or any such structure, right? Okay, so now I'm going to show you a video. So I'm not sure how this is going to look on your end based on your internet connection, but I will give a running commentary. So even if the video is a little uh, like it stops in the middle, uh, and yeah, you can still find what's going on. Okay, so there's an octopus and it comes and finds this coconut shell. So this is in the ocean, right? Not in captivity. So what it does is it picks up the coconut shell and you can see it's walking away with it, right? And what is it doing? Why is it taking this coconut shell? So it turns out that it's taking this to the other half, which it will now use to cover itself and protect against any, you know, predators that are coming along or hiding itself from prey. So yeah, it shows you that these octopuses use tools, in this case, two halves of a coconut shell, and they plan for the future. So if they are moving to some other location, they'll carry both halves of these coconut shells with them. So they are doing some kind of future planning as well, right? Which is pretty cool. Okay, so now this is a small clip about camouflage. So these are squids now, not octopuses, but they're from the same family of cephalopods, right? So on the right here, in the center is a female squid, and the squid on the left, this is the male trying to court her, right? So if you notice that has one color pattern on the side facing the female and a silvery one on the other side. But yeah, so now when this female turns, it now switches the pattern from the silver on that side to the other side, right? So what is it doing? So it turns out that there are these other male squids in the area as well, which are potential mates for this female. So this squid is trying to intimidate them by having this, you know, cold, dark, grayish pattern to like scare them off while he courts the female with the other pattern, right? So yeah, that's pretty interesting. So this behavior is called signaling. So they use different kinds of patterns like this on their bodies to communicate different things to each other. And yeah, so this is one final video. So here I like this a lot. So now here you'll see the extent of capabilities of camouflage. So yeah, so in a blink of eye, change from, I'm going to play this again just so it's changed from all this like black to this coral pattern of like green, yellow, dark gray. And yeah, so that was in an instant. This video is not sped up in any way. This is like at 1x speed. And yeah, so the speed at which they can do this is like unmatched. And maybe the distributed brain helps do that. And yeah, this kind of behavior is hiding either from prey or predators. And yeah, I just want to note here that like we humans, we can see millions of colors with the help of our 3 photoreceptors that we have in our eyes, right? So we have 3 of them. Um, you can call it red, green, and blue, which lets us see all possible combinations of these colors. And dogs have just 2 of them, right? So that's why they are partially colorblind. So if you have a dog, you might know that they are kind of red, green colorblind. They don't really, if you get them any red toys, it doesn't really matter. They can't, it's just like a dark brown or yellow for them, but they can tell like yellow and blue apart, right? So this is because they just have 2 of those. Humans have 3, dogs have 2. Octopuses, they just have 1. So technically, they should only see in grayscale, which means like from white to black with all the shades of gray in between, right? So that's what that should happen. But clearly, these octopuses can at least imitate all the possible colors that are found in the ocean, right? And yeah, so it's just that's mind-boggling how they managed to achieve that. And there's a couple of theories as to how they can do it. Um, yeah, so yeah, I've spent a lot of hours digging into that, and yeah, they seem to have some kind of, they can see from their tentacles as well. That's the way I can put, one way to put it. But yeah, that's a story for another time. The point being that these guys are like super cool, and yeah, octopuses is my new favorite species of animals. Anyway, right. So we started on the right with primates, which are very close to humans, went on to birds, then all the way to octopuses. Now, where do you think we can go from here? So let me take you back to the bigger picture, zoomed out version. Humans, primates here, birds, cephalopods, and now let's go to plants, right? So what can plants do? So, well, if you have ever had any plants at home, um, you might have seen that they tend to grow towards light, right? Uh, so it turns out that plants have these sensors with which they can uh, figure out to a very good extent the direction, intensity, and wavelength of the light that is coming in. And yeah, they do this because it is critical for their survival. They literally make their food from light. And so, yeah, so they have a rudimentary sense of sight. Yeah, so now this next picture is about, so in the middle pot, there is this parasitic plant. So a parasitic plant is one in which it can't make its own food. So it finds a host, preferably some other plant in the vicinity, which it can, you know, grasp and then suck the nutrients out of it. So they're called parasitic plants for a reason. So in this experiment, you see that this plant is in the middle. It's a parasitic plant, and these are two tubes from which the smell of these two sides can come in. So on the left is an empty pot, and on the right is a tomato plant, right? And so this parasitic plant, uh, yeah, its favorite prey is the tomato plant. It grows near the tomato plant. So you see that it always grows towards the tube from which it can, which is near the tomato plant. And yeah, there are many other such experiments which indicate that plants have a sense of smell as well. And yeah, you might have seen these plants. These are called touch me nots colloquially. So if you touch them, they will close their leaves like this, right? So they can, so they have some rudimentary sense of touch as well. And yeah, again, if you have any house plants, you might have seen something like this, that, you know, this is an upright plant, but if it, you know, accidentally falls over, the plant will then turn and again move up, and the roots will go down. Basically, they'll follow the direction of gravity. So in which, so yeah, that's why you don't have to think about which orientation I'm planting a seed in, because they just know, they have these sensors which tell them which direction is up or down based on gravity. So yeah, so in some way you can call it a sense of balance. And yeah, uh, you might have, you might think what happens in space. So yeah, people have tried doing that in growing plants in space as well. And what happens there is that you might expect the roots will now go haywire because there's no gravity to give them any direction. But it turns out plants have this kind of redundancy in which they rely on the light instead, that if they don't have any gravity to assist the direction to grow in, they'll rely on light, which means whichever direction they feel the light from, the roots will grow in the opposite direction and the shoots will grow towards the light, which is also pretty cool. And yeah, You might have seen this Venus flytrap. Yeah, apologies for the kind of gory video, but yeah, as you might have seen, a toad just walked by, and yeah, the Venus flytrap closed over it, and now it will digest the toad, the frog, and yeah, get all its nutrients from it, right? And uh, so yeah, this kind of requires a little bit of memory because it doesn't just close when you like touch it. Like you can put a finger in and it won't close. You need to do it twice within, let's say, a 20-second period for it to close. So if you, I'll play the video again, and sorry about that. Right, so the toad is already present there, but only when it moves, it starts closing in. So it had to touch it a second time within a 20-second period for it to close. If it had not moved at all, then it would have survived if it had, moved after like 30 seconds or something. So so plants have some indication of memory as well. Okay, yeah, by the way, plants don't have any nervous system at all. Like they don't have any neurons, and they still manage to do all these cool things. Okay, so this brings me to my final point that, yeah, so over the last few decades, there have been many experiments that have been conducted by behavioral psychologists and others to try and determine how smart these other living beings are, right? But these experiments tend to be anthropomorphized. So, which means that we design them based on what we think we would do. So, okay, so let's take a concrete example. So these are some pictures that I showed you for indications of tool usage, right? That the orangutan and the crow are using sticks the way we would do them, right? So we would hold them in our hand and use them as spears or, to prod and poke certain things. So yeah, so naturally people try to see this kind of tool usage in other animals as well, right? So one of the experiments was on elephants. So elephants by many standards are considered quite intelligent, right? They have awesome memory and they have also complex social structures to live in and things like that. But it turned out that, so the experiment was that they hung some fruits from some height, which was out of the reach from the elephant's trunk. And then there were a bunch of sticks put around that elephant so that, it could grasp a stick and, knock the foot down if it wanted to, but the elephant just wouldn't do that. And yeah, the scientists were thinking, okay, why is this the case? I mean, they are very intelligent in many other ways. Why can't they use tools? So it turns out that what was happening is the trunk, or basically the sense of smell, is the most important sensory organ for an elephant. So for example, for humans, eyes are the most uh, crucial sensory organ that we rely on, right? And so grasping a stick with its trunk meant that it would have to close its nose, basically, and that is depriving it of its most crucial sensory organ. So their sense of smell is like 100,000 times more sensitive than humans. They rely on that a lot. And they don't want to let go of that in order to get food, right? And yeah, I mean, you can imagine that, right? Like if there was something you had to do with your eyes closed, you would try to look for an alternative which does not involve that, right? And so, yeah, so the scientists changed the experiment in which now instead of these sticks, they put, big blocks of like stones or tires, which the elephant could use. And sorry, yeah, so that's what happened. So the elephant knocked the tire all the way to the center, then put its feet on top of that, and then it could reach the food, right? So it could use tools, but in a different way. Yeah, so the point being that a lot of measures of intelligence that we use for testing animals and other living beings are human-centric. And animals can do a lot of things that we can't. And yeah, for all practical purposes, we might seem pretty dumb to them, if we can't, navigate with the Earth's magnetic field, or if we can't change colors and all these things, then yeah, we might seem pretty dumb to all these animals. So yeah, so final slide. So we have seen some examples of living beings doing smart things in response to the challenges presented in the environment that they live in, right? So we have gone from monkeys in the jungle, birds in the air, octopuses in deep water, and to stationary plants. And so I love this quote by Darwin. So this is from one of his books in 1871. He wrote that, nevertheless, the difference in mind between man and higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. So in 1871, he basically said that intelligence is a spectrum. And in this talk, we saw a glimpse of the many dimensions to it. Via evolution, numerous such intelligent systems have evolved in parallel in nature, which suggests that there are some general principles with which organisms successfully achieve goals in the world around them. And discovering these general principles is one of the most important questions for science right now. And that this question is undoubtedly my favorite one. And with that, I will open the floor for questions. Thank you so much.
That's awesome. Thank you, Abhishek. This is fantastic. We do have time for a couple of quick questions here before we jump right into talk number 2. And I actually have one to start off. So you alluded to some experiments that have shown an indication that plants may be able to showcase some sense of smell. Can you speak to that a little bit more? What do those look like?
Yes, so the one that I showed you had, if I can go back to it quickly. Awesome. Right, so in this particular experiment, there was this plant in the middle, and it has to, the only means of its survival is by latching onto some other plant, right? And so it needs to find out where this other plant is, right? And so this plant is like kept in a black box, which means it can't use light as such. And the only inlets are inlets of air. And this inlet comes from the right side, which is near a tomato plant. And this inlet comes from a plant, just a pot. There is no plant there. And this plant will grow towards the one from which it smelled the tomato. And there have been experiments in which you replace the tomato plant by just a tomato perfume, and this would still happen. And there are all these other experiments in which, let's say, there are these kinds of trees which are attacked by beetles. So let's say the beetles have attacked some particular branches. So now these branches will release some kind of pheromones, which the other branches or the trees nearby can smell, and then they eject some kind of chemicals which are poisonous to the beetles, so that the beetles don't attack them, right? So all of this is done with just the release of some chemicals by the affected branch, which then these other branches and other trees in the nearby surroundings use. So these are some kind of experiments people have done for the sense of smell. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. It blows my mind. It's really exciting to hear some of the thoughts around just some of the more nature focused aspects of intelligence. So this is really cool. I've been really geeking out over here. Okay, next question is, do you have any ideas for how AI agents can incorporate some of the insights in this talk?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's kind of what I think a lot about. Yeah, so from this particular talk, we looked at ways in which uh, beings like chimps could communicate, chimps and birds, and then they could use these certain senses to detect the Earth's magnetic field and use it. And then we looked at octopuses who had this completely different sense of the surroundings through its tentacles and such, which could, detect color and transform into it within seconds. And then these stationary plants who could do a lot of these things, right? So what can we there are a lot of principles to learn from here. Some at the implementation level, some at the more abstract level. So, at the implementation level, you can, the a simple insight could be that, uh, again, maybe the AI agents that we develop are, again, human centric in a way that uh, we give them senses that we think are useful, right? So we would give them some kind of vision, some cameras, we'll put some cameras on them, and then we'll have some kind of, two arms, or um, some kind of some mobility like that, which is, very much inspired by humans. And one of the things that we can learn from this talk is that there are so many other types of senses that you could rely on, which we have no idea about. For example, the Earth's magnetic field, right? Or, gravity, a sensor for gravity. Or uh, in case of octopus, so a lot of AI agents have like this single control system in which you take all these senses, decide some action, and then send that action out, and then it does it, right? And repeat. These octopuses, they have a distributed kind of system, right? In which their tentacles can kind of take actions on their own without having to communicate with the central brain, which is this very small entity anyway. So yeah, so that is also something we could incorporate, like have some kind of distributed, decentralized processing that could go on in our uh, intelligent beings. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of things we could learn from nature, and we don't necessarily have to be constrained to human-like biology and human-like brain structures when we are building artificial intelligence agents.
That's great. The last question here is kind of a quick follow-up that's similar, but are you aware of any existing ML methods that are inspired by some of these non-human or biological approaches?
I think, yeah, a lot of these trends are coming into ML slowly, but you can see a lot of them in engineering, right? Like, for example, the boats that we build are kind of shaped like fish, right? Because we know fish can do this well. And the planes that we have, the wing design, that is kind of, again, inspired by how birds take flight, right? So we have this kind of biomimicry going on in which we are taking inspiration from nature and applying them in the kind of technological products that we are building. Um, yeah, so in machine learning, it's been a little slow to catch on, but yeah, I guess you can argue that multi-agent systems is kind of basically a distributed intelligence system in which you have this kind of a hive mind sort of structure where all of these different agents are doing some kind of processing independently and taking actions while also having maybe some kind of communication amongst themselves for some sort of cooperation. So um, yeah, whether or not this was inspired by octopuses is a different question, but we do see some elements here. But yeah, this is a very ripe and rich area to take inspiration from and start applying in machine learning agents. And I would highly encourage people to think about that. And yeah, so I would like to point out to these. So if you want to get started with some of these, cool videos that you saw or some things to read about, I would like to point out these last two links that I mentioned in the references. So the second last one is basically a Netflix episode on this from the show called Explained. So this episode was on animal intelligence, and a lot of things that you saw in this talk uh, came from here. And there is this another talk about which focuses on cephalopods. It's a TED talk. It's another very brilliant one. Would highly recommend. And yeah, these are some of the books from which um, I presented some of the content about Alex, about the octopuses, and what a plant knows. So maybe people could check this out too if they're interested. But yeah, feel free to drop me an email if you want to talk more about such kind of things. I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abhishek. That's great. And again, if anyone wants to take him up on that offer, feel free to send us a note, hello@amii.ca, and we can help you to get in touch to chat further. This is fantastic. So we're going to keep the momentum going here and jump right into our next talk. So as Abhishek stops sharing his screen, we can get Quinn set up. So we're going to be jumping in for another short presentation from Quinn Boser from the BLINC Lab to talk about some of the new techniques for prosthetic devices, how those are developed and assessed. So let's jump right into that. Take it away, Quinn.
Excellent. Thank you, Warren, and thanks, Abhishek. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, like Warren said, my name is Quinn Boser, and I work with the BLINC Lab at the University of Alberta. So I thought I would just kind of start by introducing myself because I know some people from Amii, but I'm not really plugged in. So I think probably a lot of people might not know me. So yeah, so I currently work as a research assistant at the BLINC Lab. And if anyone doesn't know, BLINC Lab stands for Bionic Limbs for Improved Natural Control. And it's sort of an interdisciplinary group of people that are all focused on improving the way that humans interact with technology and kind of specifically upper limb prostheses mostly. So yeah, right now I work as a research assistant. Before that, I did my master's with the lab. And before that, I did a degree in mechanical engineering. So sort of a disclaimer, I am not really an expert in machine learning. The lab does do quite a bit of machine learning work, but it's not exactly my field. So my kind of level of knowledge there is like I've done the Coursera course. So don't get too intense with the machine learning questions. But yeah, I'm really interested in technology, and especially technology that kind of helps again after an injury. I'm getting a message that says my internet connection is unstable. So usually my internet is really good, but the last few days have been kind of weird. So please let me know if you missed something. Yeah, if not, I'll just keep going and hope that you're all hearing me. Yeah, so I like two devices right now. So if someone was to need an upper limb prosthesis today, there are kind of three main types that they would have available to them. And the first is usually called turning off the video feed may help. Like for me, should I try turning off my video feed? Yes. Okay, I'm gonna try to turn off my video, which I guess will make it slightly less exciting because you won't be able to see me.
Yeah, no problem, Quinn.
We'll give it a try and see how it goes. And yes, please do let me know if I'm cutting out or if something's not working. So yeah, so there's three main types of prosthetic devices. The first is called passive prostheses. And so usually these prostheses don't move. They're just always in kind of a resting position. But there's some really cool technology that goes on in this area where basically they try to make the prostheses look as realistic as possible. So the first picture on the left, this person is wearing prostheses. And usually when I ask people in a live presentation to guess which one it is, oftentimes people get it right. It is this one, their left hand. But if you saw this person walking down the street or something, you probably wouldn't like initially assume that they were wearing a prosthesis or notice. And for some people, that's exactly what they want. But again, these don't move, so you can't like use them to actually grasp something or pick something up. Kind of the opposite end of the spectrum is what's called a body-powered prostheses. And so these move entirely mechanically. So there's no electronics here. It's just the person wears kind of a harness, and then there are cables that run from the harness to the end of the prostheses that are just set up in such a way that when the person does kind of a specific shrugging motion, it pulls on the cable, and then that like pulls open the usually it's a hook at the end of the prostheses. So often these kind of don't really look very much like an anatomic limb at all, but they're very, very functional and robust. And even though this is very old technology, this is still a really common prostheses that people use, just because of how reliable it is. And then the last kind is, of course, the robotic prostheses. This is kind of what we're seeing recently, super shiny and exciting looking robots. But the truth is actually robotic or externally powered prostheses have been available since about the 1970s commercially. So they're not that new, but they're still only used by probably less than half of prosthesis users. About like the same number of people that choose to use a robotic prosthesis. There's about the same number of people that would still choose a body part prosthesis instead. So it's pretty much split. Like these aren't more popular yet. Even though they're not that new anymore, they've been available for a while. And the really big limitations when it comes to robotic prostheses, they look pretty exciting, but there's still some big limitations in how you use them. And so the objective of the BLINC Lab is to basically kind of improve these types of prostheses. And there's sort of three main facets that we approach this from. And I actually mostly work with the last one, which is developing assessments for these new types of technologies. But I want to talk about the other two first because they're kind of cool, and also kind of provide some context for how we've chosen to develop these assessments. So and there's kind of a number of reasons why the situation for controlling these prostheses isn't great. But I think the main one is an issue of basically trying to map too few inputs to too many outputs. So the most common way that people would control a robotic prostheses, if you got a commercially available one today, is using surface EMG. So putting electrodes on the surface of the residual limb and then detecting when the person contracts the muscles in their residual limb. And so usually you would put electrodes on like two opposing muscle groups that you still had. And from that, you can basically get 4 pieces of information, which is like, so as an example here, I've shown an example where, say, a person has an amputation above the elbow, but they still have part of their upper arm. So we would put electrodes on the biceps and triceps. And then basically you would get information when they're flexing their biceps, versus when they're flexing their triceps. So they would be thinking like, I'm flexing my elbow versus I'm extending my elbow. You could also contract both at the same time. We call that a co-contraction, or you could be relaxed, not contracting either. So it's only like 4 distinct pieces of information. But robotic hands these days have a whole bunch of different grasp patterns. And that's only the hand. A lot of the time, you'll also have maybe the ability to control the wrist rotation, or you might have an elbow that you also want to control. What about something like this? This is sort of like one of the newest prosthetic devices, and it has every degree of freedom that the human hand has, including like abducting the fingers or like spreading them apart. Of course, nobody really uses this in their daily life because it costs like $500,000 still, but how would you even like think about trying to have somebody control something like this using our current methods? So there are a lot of different things that people are trying to do to work on this problem of control. Solutions, I put a question mark because, you know, a lot of these aren't really, we don't know, that they're still kind of in the research phase. One thing that is actually available is pattern recognition. So there's a couple companies now that have come out with, instead of having to use that situation that I just talked about, where you just use 2 opposing muscle groups, and you can get only kind of 4 pieces of information at a time. There are some systems that have come out where basically you just put kind of as many electrodes as you can on the person's residual limb, and then you use a machine learning classifier to try to get some more information out of these signals. And this actually works pretty well. You can usually decode, I think, like up to 6 different kind of intentions. Another thing that our lab actually looks at is like surgical means of trying to improve this situation. So there's a surgery it was developed in Chicago, but the U of A was the first hospital to do it in Canada. And it's called targeted reinnervation surgery. And so basically the nerves that used to go to an amputated limb, when you have an amputation, the nerves are still there. And what the surgeons do is they go in and find like a healthy muscle group that the person still has, and they kind of disconnect the nerves that are going to that muscle group, and then basically plug in the nerves that used to go to the amputated limb. So now when the individual thinks about, say, closing their hand, the muscles that were re-innervated would contract. So in this picture, the example, they're using chest muscles. So this person would think about closing their hand, and then somewhere on their chest, a muscle would contract. And we could detect that. And so that makes the control a bit more intuitive, because instead of thinking about bending your elbow or trying to contract your chest like Terry Crews, you can actually think about closing your hand, and we can use that information to close your hand. People are also looking at implanting electrodes instead of using surface EMG. Another surgery is called osseointegration, and this is the main point of this is actually to get rid of the socket interface for connecting a prosthesis to a person, and instead have an implant that connects the prostheses directly to their bone. But getting rid of the socket also has some benefits for control, because you just don't have to deal with a socket movement and stuff anymore. And then, of course, at the BLINC Lab, we look at trying to use reinforcement learning. So pattern recognition is an example of machine learning being applied here, but we want to look at instead of kind of those methods, can we add some kind of intelligence to the arm where it sort of learns how the person is trying to use it over time, and makes it easier for the individual to use it. So the sort of most concrete example that we've developed is one really common way that people will control if they want to control multiple joints in a prosthesis, or if they want to have access to multiple grasp patterns, is that they'll just switch through a set list of joints or grasp patterns or both, and only ever control one at a time. And can you still see me? I just lost like everyone's video, so I just want to check.
Yeah, it's still clear for me.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, great. So anyway, so one thing that we've been working on at the BLINC Lab is, instead of having to switch through a set list of things, could we add in sort of a reinforcement learning agent that is predicting what grip pattern or what joint you want to control next, and always reordering that list to give you the thing that it thinks you'll want next, up next. And then finally, another thing is just training. A big problem with these devices is they're really expensive, and it's kind of hard to try them before you buy them, because they have to be like fit to the individual. And so basically the first student at the BLINC Lab, Rory Dawson, developed this desktop mounted arm, the bento arm, which Amii has one now for demos. But its original purpose was as a training device, so that people could try controlling a robotic prosthesis before they decided to invest in one, basically. The other big problem with prosthetic devices is a feedback problem. So usually I can see my audience, so apologies if this doesn't apply to you, but I think most of us, if I asked you to locate an object on your desk, say your phone or your water bottle or something, then close your eyes and then pick up that object, most of us would be pretty comfortable doing that, even if it was like a glass of water or something that could spill or something fragile, because we are getting a wealth of information from our limbs all the time, information about like whether or not they're moving, whether or not they're touching something, where they're located in space. When you're using a prosthetic device, you don't get any of this information. So that is totally cut off. And what a lot of people report is they feel like they always have to look at their prostheses, because that's the only basically like type of feedback they can get is visual feedback about the prostheses. But it's kind of a pain to always have to look at your prostheses. So a lot of people are trying to look into, you know, whether we can provide some other types of sensory information from the prostheses to the wearer. So there's also a ton of different research going into this. People are looking at using like vibrotactile feedback. So basically think about how like your video game controllers communicate with you. Electrotactile, so like basically small electrodes on the residual limb that would try to excite the nerves using some like a small electrical current. What we mainly look at in the BLINC Lab is mechanotactile, so essentially like applying force onto the residual limb. And this is nice because it's modality matched, we say. So basically, mostly what we're looking at is having sensors on the fingers that are, or the hand that are detecting whether or not there's force, or like the hand is in contact with something, or basically like the grip force that you're encountering. And then we would just relay that with like a proportional force to the person. So this is like they are experiencing the same type of feedback. There also the surgery that I mentioned earlier can be done not just so that you can contract the muscles, but also so that you can connect the sensory nerves, so that some people have this surgery so that when you touch a point on the reinnervated area, it feels like they're amputated, they're being touched on their amputated limb somewhere. Like it feels like you're touching their hand. So we can map that, and then we could actually provide like somatically mapped feedback. People are also looking at implanted electrodes here to provide feedback, to excite the nerves directly. But this is still very much like research. We don't know how well these last over a long period of time. And then finally, something that another thing that we've looked at is with people that have had this targeted reinnervation surgery, can we take advantage of something called the kinesthetic illusion, which is basically when you vibrate tendinous region at a specific frequency, you can make someone feel like a muscle is moving even though it's not. And so we wanted to look at, can we make a person with an amputation feel like their hand is moving? So then you get not just a sense of like touch, but a sense of movement. And then lastly, we're also looking at, can we apply reinforcement learning in this area? So this is Adam Parker, who's a PhD student at the BLINC Lab. What he's mostly looking into. So basically, if you give an agent a number of different options for ways to communicate with the user, will it kind of identify a best or like most effective way of communicating? And then, as I mentioned, the last thing that we look at is assessment. So this has been kind of a whirlwind tour of different things that we and other labs around the world are trying to do to improve these devices. But then the question comes up, you know, how do we know what's working? And some of these things, you know, can be combined together. Some of them are mutually exclusive. Some of them might hinder the other. And so, you know, basically we need to be able to tell like what directions we should go in the future. And so obviously you can ask people, you can have people try out these solutions and ask them, and you should, but it's also nice to have like a qualitative way to assess these things. So this is mostly where my research actually comes in. So we've developed this assessment that we call GAMMA, which stands for Gaze and Movement Assessment. And basically we've developed some tasks that we have people do while we're tracking their movement with a bunch of motion capture markers and a motion capture system, and also tracking their eye gaze behavior with an eye tracker. So I'll show you an example of one of the tasks. We call this the pasta box task, and it would just basically have people move a box of pasta between shelves at different heights, which is actually sort of notoriously difficult for prosthesis users, reaching up high like that. And then I will switch out of this presentation and I'll go to sort of a live demo of the software that we've developed for analyzing this data. So this is what the software would look like basically when you just like load in the raw motion capture data. So I'll kind of like play through a trial. All of these dots were different markers that we are tracking on the person. So maybe you can sort of start to see that there's a person moving an object around there. Maybe you can't, but it's a little bit hard to interpret at this point or like use this data very meaningfully. So we created tools in the software that basically allow you to define relationships between the markers that you're tracking and the actual objects that you are tracking. So you can use that to say where were these actual objects and how are they moving through space. As long as you have more at least 3 markers on an object, you can get its position and its orientation, and you can create sort of like a virtual scene. So I've added in the objects now. So now when I play through the trial, hopefully you can kind of get a better feel for what is going on. We have a virtual representation now of the object that the person was interacting with, and where their hand or end effector is and where all of the other objects are that might be interesting in the task. But of course, we also want to add in information from the eye tracker that we have. So that is tracking where the person's pupils are as they're doing this task. And I'll show you what the data looks like that we get from that. So this is just a trace over time of the person's pupils. And usually in traditional, if you're doing sort of traditional analysis of eye tracking, you would relate this to where they were looking in a two-dimensional view from a camera that is on their head facing forward. But that still requires a lot of manual labor. Basically, someone has to go in and code every frame to actually say like what they were looking at. So we want to be able to add this information into our three-dimensional scene because we have all this information from the motion tracking. And so this is kind of the first place that machine learning comes in to my work. We basically collect some calibration data to train a model to basically relate where the person's pupils are from the eye tracker with where they were looking in this 3D scene. And so I'll add that in, and now you can see there's like this pink line coming out of the person's face. And so this is our prediction of where the person was looking in their environment. We call it a gaze vector. And so now when I play through, you can see that the gaze vector moves around in a way that kind of makes sense. They, look at the thing they're about to pick up, and then they look where they're going to set it down. And so now it's really easy for us to just detect relationships between all of these things. We can detect when the gaze vector is intersecting different objects that we're interested in, or for what we're interested in a lot with prosthesis users is how much are they looking at their prosthesis or their end effector. And then finally, we've made some really cool tools to basically detect different events that are happening in the data. So what we use those for is to kind of like label different phases or segments of our task. And so one example is we can use the velocity of the box that the person is moving around. So this is a trace of the box's velocity. We can look for basically like when the box starts and stops moving, and we can use that to identify like when they're transporting this box. And so yeah, we use all these tools to basically define a whole bunch of different metrics. We can pull out all this information like when you're transporting the box, what are you looking at? What percentage of that time do you spend looking at your hand versus looking ahead at where you're going to set the box down? So I'll show you an example of what basically what we would get out of this comparison between an able-bodied individual and someone who's using a myoelectric prosthesis or like a robotic prosthesis that they're controlling with their muscle signals. So I've slowed down the able-bodied individual dramatically because obviously there's just a difference in how fast they do this. But here I'm gonna try to go back and then play that again. Hopefully another thing you can notice is that the able-bodied individual, pretty much as soon as they pick up the box, they are looking ahead at where they're going to set it down. But the person using the prostheses takes quite a bit longer to kind of get like a stable grasp. And even at the end of this movement, we get the participants to always put their hand back at like we call it a home position. And able-bodied individuals, they don't really have to look at their hand to be able to put it at this home position, but the prosthesis user, you can see they have to look down to make sure their hand is in that right position or their end effector, their prosthesis. So here's the next movement. Again, you can just kind of see like how the able-bodied person is able to transition their gaze so much earlier. And yeah, so we can kind of now pull this, what we're seeing out in like a qualitative measure. So one example is we can look at how much of, when the person is transporting the box, what percentage of that time do they spend looking ahead at where they're going to drop off the box. So we looked at 20 able-bodied people to get kind of like a normative mean. And we saw that in the first two movements, for the first two times they move the box in this test, they're able to look ahead like 75 to 70 to 80%. Whereas the person who is using that myoelectric prostheses, they're only able to look ahead like 40 to 55%. So they're spending way less time looking ahead, basically, when they do this task. The last movement is kind of interesting because it's this, here, I'll play it. It's this cross-body movement where you're putting the box back where you got it originally. And interestingly, the able-bodied individuals don't look ahead as much in that one when they have to kind of cross the body. Anyway, so this is kind of one example of one metric we can pull out between the different phases in our task and all of the different basically data that we can get from the eye tracker and looking at different measures of like how people are moving as well. We can pull out over 100 metrics per trial of someone doing this. And so that's fantastic, but it can add up to a lot of data. And especially we want to be able to make this clinically applicable. And in the clinic, you don't really want to hand someone like 100 different numbers to try to look at, to try to tell like if someone's prostheses is like working well for them. So this is kind of the next point or in the project where we're hoping to sort of bring in like a data science or machine learning approach to kind of try to boil down all of this data into ideally a smaller number of more informative metrics, or maybe even like one meaningful composite score. But that's sort of in the future. That's just something that we hope to do. But if you are interested in that type of thing, certainly reach out and let us know. Just a couple other places that we're going with this. We're looking at also adding in more information. So adding in EEG tracking. And actually this specific project, this was some people that we worked very closely with, and they were looking at could they use that EEG data to train a classifier that then predicted which cup someone was about to pick up. So they designed a task where you had to move these cups around, and there's 4 different movements, and in each movement you were picking up a different cup first. So they wanted to see if they could use the EEG data right before someone was about to reach for a cup to predict which cup they're about to reach for. And they were able to predict with, I think, like 57% accuracy, which is not amazing, but better than chance. So that's just kind of a cool, interesting thing. And then the other thing we're looking at doing is bringing all of this into VR, because VR is actually a really affordable and excellent way to get motion and eye tracking data. Most VR headsets come with either an eye tracker already built in or the ability to add eye tracking. And they give you all of this rich movement data. And so, so yeah, we're also looking at implementing this stuff in VR, and then there's a variety of interesting things that we can look at. It also ties back in with the prosthetic stuff, because you could look at having someone train to use like a virtual prosthetic before getting one, again, similar to like the desktop mounted training. So yeah, that is pretty much it for what I had prepared. I really want to acknowledge that this was not just my work that I'm talking about, but the efforts of very, very many people, especially Dr. Craig Chapman and Riley Dawson, who are kind of like the main other developers on the software that I showed. But yeah, many people's work represented here. This is probably not even a complete list. Yeah, and if there's any questions, I would love to take them.
This is fantastic. Thanks, Quinn. I really wish we had an audience applause soundbite or something that we could play here. We have to work on that for next time. For those of you, you can feel free to raise your hand or jump into the Q&A box if you have questions to follow up with Quinn.
So we do have one question in the Q&A box. A question asks, how do you go about building the gaze line?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I purposefully didn't talk about it too much because then it leaves something for people to ask. So basically we looked at kind of a few different ways of doing this, but in essence, we collect some calibration data where we have the person wear the eye tracker and then look at a marker that we're tracking in the, like with the motion capture system, so that we know the exact 3D location of like what point they're fixating on. And then we looked at a few different basically like things to do while we were collecting this calibration data. Our first sort of instinct was to have them track like a marker on a wand and move that marker around the whole like task space, basically. So we would like move it around the whole area where they were going to be doing the task and just have them like follow it with their gaze, and then take that data and use it to train. It's actually, we tried a couple different things and we landed on just a linear regressor with quadratic terms. But anyway, so we tried a few different things for like this calibration routine. What we landed on was actually just this. We hold the marker that they're looking at stationary, and we have them instead move their head around in kind of like a variety of different ways, look up and down, and then make spirals with your head, and always just like keep looking at the marker. And so yeah, like we collected a bunch of data to kind of assess a few different options for this gaze calibration routine, and this is what we landed on as the best one. And actually, interestingly, the eye tracker that we use, Pupil Labs, they totally independently ended up coming out with a very similar gaze calibration routine for calibrating just the eye tracker when you're trying to predict where the person's looking in just like that 2D camera view. So it's kind of interesting that separately we came up with this like good calibration, but that is what we find works best. And then, like I said, we take the coordinates of the marker that the person was looking at, we convert them into the coordinates of their like head coordinate system. So we're tracking their head, how it's rotating, and also polar coordinates. So we're really mainly interested in like the direction of that line. We also predict how far away the fixation point is, but we find that we don't get very good accuracy in that like distance. So we're mostly interested in like the theta and phi coordinates. And then we just train like a linear model. We use MATLAB, fit LM. We're certainly open to suggestions here. It's not as though we think that the linear model is like definitely the best. Just in our kind of limited experience, it seemed to work quite well and we were happy with it. But if anyone has any ideas, I would love to hear them.
Awesome. We have a two-part question now. Question one asks, when will I have an ability to get additional limbs? And two, did you consider using Blender 3D for your body tracking needs instead of building custom solutions?
Sorry, you're kind of cutting out at the end. Did we consider using Blender 3D?
Yes, for body tracking needs instead of building custom solutions.
To be completely honest, I'm not entirely familiar with Blender 3D. So I guess the answer would be no, we didn't consider it. I'd have to look into what it does. But we really wanted the ability to like analyze the eye tracking data and the motion tracking data in kind of like integrated together. And at the time that we started developing this, we weren't aware of any software that had the ability to do like an integrated analysis of both. And we're also interested in, as I kind of mentioned really quickly, in extending to be able to add in like other modalities like EEG and EMG and force plates. And so building like a custom solution allows us to really easily make it kind of like extensible. So that was another reason for that. I guess I sort of skipped over the when will you be able to get additional limbs. You should ask Adam Parker about this. I know that some of his work has focused on kind of basically trying to look at how could how would a person interact with an extra limb? Because again, you kind of have the same control problem. Like we don't really, we're like using most of our body we use quite effectively. We don't really have like extra control inputs that we could use to control an extra limb without sort of like disrupting how we already function, at least not really obvious ones. So yeah, there becomes kind of this question of like, well, how would you control it? How would you interact with it? And I know that Adam was sort of looking at that a little bit. So if you don't already know Adam Parker, you should get in touch.
Awesome. And then one final question before we wrap for the day here. And the question is, if participants are interested in helping with the dimension reduction problem that you mentioned, who can they contact or how can they get in contact with you or the BLINC Lab?
Oh, yeah, excellent. Great question. They can contact me. I usually have my email at the end of presentations, but then I knew that this was going to be on YouTube, and so I decided to pull it. But so I think like in the last presentation, Warren mentioned that you could contact Amii, and then they will happily put you in contact with me and or Riley, who is another developer on this project, and we would love to talk to you about that.
Excellent. Obviously, connect us and we will connect you here. I think we may have lost Warren, just internet connectivity. So I'm happy to wrap up and one of you two are our speakers, Edmund and Quinn. Fascinating, really interesting topics today, and we are very grateful for you to spend your time with us this afternoon. Finally, one final housekeeping thing. We are hosting our next AI meetup July 16th. So at this time, there's already an invite up. Feel free to find us, find the event, and we hope to see you all again. And we wish you all a happy evening. Thanks again, everyone.
That's great. Thanks for all the kind words coming in on the chat. This has been a lot of fun.